So we are very happy to be joined as we continue the show here by Manolo De Los Santos, who's a co-director of the People's Forum, and also Reed Lindsay, a journalist and filmmaker. Thank you both so much for being with us here on the show.
Thank you.
Honored to be here again.
Well, Manolo, I'll start with you. Maybe this is just kind of a framing question. I mean, where are we now in this? It was like the big world news kicked off with I think it was July 11th protests that were critiquing some aspects of the economic and social situation there. This past Saturday, we saw big mobilizations in favor of the Socialist Project of Cuba. Now we're seeing more sanctions. I mean, where are we now in this process?
Well, it's funny to call it a process. I don't know if we could call it such a thing, but it's definitely something that's been taking place. I would say where we're at now is that these so-called major protests for freedom, or to end the communist revolution in Cuba, however they want to call it now, continue to exist mostly and mainly on Twitter, on social media, and in Miami, not inside Cuba. And at the same time, the United States government continues through its spokespersons, through President Biden, to engage in what I would say is hostile language, talking about sanctions again against Cuban officials today. Talk of, finding new ways to intervene in Cuba in relationship to what's been happening. I think that's what mostly has been happening, is that the U.S. is finding new ways to tightening the aggressive actions against Cuba.
Well, Reed, some of the work you do is with Belly of the Beast, which is an independent media outlet that covers covers U.S.-Cuba relations, and I think does a fantastic job, quite frankly, of showing what isn't seen in the mainstream media. I mean, seeing what's happening in Cuba now, how are you reflecting on just the way Cuba is presented, especially to Americans, and certainly the issues on the island?
Well, I think what Manolo said was absolutely right, and it's really hard being here in Cuba because I'm online a lot. Contrary to what's being said in the media, the internet actually is working here. It's incredible to keep hearing about, we have to do something about the internet. We have to bring internet to the Cuban people. Well, everyone here has internet. I'm in Cuba, and it's not big. I do have it in my home, and that's a somewhat privileged position because not everyone has internet in their homes. But I also have it on my phone, and everyone I know has it on their phone as well, in the street or on the homes. It was cut for very short period of time, but internet's here. So I'm watching news in the U.S. I mean, everything from Fox to, which I just saw this crazy interview with Hannity and Rubio and Miami at the Versailles Cafe, to just mainstream to more liberal outlets, and it's so to Biden's actions and comments, the administration's, which are coming out every day, and everything going on in Miami. It's crazy, the disconnect between the reality on the ground and what's being said. I mean, particularly what the Biden administration is saying, and then what the media is sort of parroting and essentially failing to call him out on the most on things. So I'll give you 3 examples. Biden has offered to help Cuba in 3 concrete ways: send vaccines to Cuba, provide internet to Cubans, and find a way so that Cubans can access remittances without those passing through state-run financial institutions in Cuba.
It's crazy.
Cuba already has all those 3 things. Cuba has vaccines. I just got my 3rd vaccine this morning, the Abdullah vaccine. Cuba produces 2 of the top 5 vaccines in the world as far as efficacy. They're both above 90%, very close to Moderna and Pfizer. I just got my 3rd shot. In the end of this month, all of Havana, the adult population, will have been vaccinated. 30% of the population has received at least 1 dose, I believe. The whole country will be vaccinated in the coming months. So they're vaccinating at a faster rate right now, at one of the fastest rates of any country in the world at the moment. Also, bigger perspective, COVID, Cuba's had 5 times fewer cases per capita of COVID than the United States. So 5 times less likely to get COVID in Cuba. And if you get COVID, you're 3 times less likely to die for it, mortality from it in Cuba. The mortality rate is 3 times lower in the US than it is in the US, even with the recent spike of cases in Cuba. And let's look at why there may have been a recent spike in cases. Cuba's vaccine, the production of Cuba's vaccine, one of its two major ones, not the one I got, but the other one called Soberana, which means sovereign, was delayed for an unknown period of time. That, according to the top pharmaceutical company in Cuba, which produces this vaccine, it was because they could not obtain raw materials from a company that provides them because of U.S. sanctions. And I just got just in an interview 2 days ago with the top executive from that company, said that right now in mid-July, right now as of today, Cuba would already have had all of the vaccines it needs to vaccinate the entire population produced if it were not for U.S. sanctions. Wow. So it's ironic, it's cynical. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's those comments by Biden are stupid because it's not what Cuba needs. It's certainly not the reason people were taking the streets. And now no one was calling for vaccines, even people against the government. And so yeah. Were you gonna ask something?
I'm just curious, since you're actually there and you're talking about the disconnect. I even think these new sanctions are kind of a disconnect. It's really just completely political posturing. Like the Cuban, this made me laugh a little bit. The Treasury Department named 78-year-old Cuban national Alvaro Lopez Miera and the Interior Ministry as targets of the sanctions. I'm just thinking to myself, a 78-year-old Alvaro, now he can't come to the U.S. Now he can't come to the U.S. and vacation in Miami, I guess. But I mean, the Interior Ministry as a target of sanctions. I mean, to target more of Cuba with sanctions when it's having such a devastating impact already in such a concrete way. Can you give us an idea of what those shortages look like in Cuba? Because there are, fuel shortages. There's blackouts from what, we're being told here. Or not here, I'm in Lebanon, but you know what I mean. From what we're being told in the U.S., there's blackouts. You mentioned the shortage and how it's impacting the vaccine situation, but are there actual grievances over the shortages caused by U.S. sanctions? And do people on the ground, at least from what you've seen, tend to understand it as a consequence of U.S. sanctions, or is it building resentment against the government?
It is definitely building resentment against the Cuban government. There's no doubt about that. And some people do see it as the U.S. I think a lot of people have that understanding. A lot of people don't. And if you go back and this has been, there's a famous memo from April 1960, Lester Mallory, where he's a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. It's 4 months after Revolution, where he was basically arguing for the embargo. And he basically said, yeah, we need the embargo so that we can cause hunger and desperation, and essentially we can create an economic crisis in Cuba, and that will lead to the overthrow of the government. Because people will blame the Cuban government, because that's what's in front of them. The U.S. embargo is hard to see. It's hard to see, like when the Cuban government is trying to purchase some raw material they need to produce a medicine from a company in Europe, but because all the banks are blocked, they have to send a transaction through a bank in India, which they generally use, and then suddenly the U.S. Treasury Department happens to crack down on that bank, close the accounts. Cuba's got to scramble to find some other bank to do it, and then the medicine gets there 3 months later. Or for example, when a ship shows up, like is about to leave Mexico and come to Cuba, and suddenly the shipping company says, no, we can't do it. And then and the medicine doesn't, and the materials don't get there for another 3 months, because Cuba produces most of its own medicine. So it basically imports raw materials to produce the medicine. Those are things that are difficult to understand and explain. It's difficult even as a journalist to find out about these things, because the Cubans don't like to give details. Because if they start revealing names and details, the Treasury Department will go after those companies. And so they sort of keep things close to the vest. But what it means is that the population it's very hard to know the impact of the blockade and why, like why when I go to the pharmacy, there's no aspirin. Why are there no antibiotics? The Cuban government, they go out and they explain these things. But also you have to understand, people have been living under blockade for more than 60 years. At some point, too, as much as the government or anyone else tells you that, oh, it's the U.S.'s fault, you stop believing it. And what's in front of you is the Cuban government. So you blame it's natural, normal, and expected that you would blame the authorities that are sitting right in front of you. And so a lot of the anger about the shortages and the blame has been directed at the Cuban government. Even a major cause of it is U.S. government policy.
Well, Manolo, I mean, I'll toss a similar question in your direction. I mean, I think that it really, well, I think this was said about Chile years ago, the whole make the economy scream piece. But I mean, that is, and you know, we could say the same thing about Iran. We could say the same thing about Venezuela. I mean, it really does feel like it's almost like a gun to the head kind of policy. Like, well, we're going to make it as tough as possible, but you know how you could get rid of all these things is to change the people we obviously don't like. I mean, it seems like that really is the general thrust, Manolo.
I mean, it's definitely, I mean, I agree with Reed that essentially this has been consistently the policy since the Mallory document back in 1960. I mean, of screwing the Cuban economy to the point where people have no other option but to resent the Cuban government. I think the fact that even when President Biden speaks to the Cuban people, he's saying, you know, we won't allow remittances. It's because of the Cuban government's fault, because they would somehow confiscate the remittances that arrive on the island. There's this constant sort of blaming of the Cuban government. And I think, you know, I understand where the Cuban people are at, but I'm definitely seeing from the outside, not just how the US government is moving, but essentially how there's a social media, there's a cyber war that's taking place that is placing undue attention all of a sudden on the Cuban government as this particular culprit responsible for all the ills that take place inside the island. I think the fact that, like Reed said, the blockade gets obliterated from public discourse, the fact that no one talks about the fact that the US does go after Cuba's right to commerce with other countries, the fact that no one dares to explain that it's not just an antagonistic relationship between Cuba and the United States, but that the US with the blockade actually intervenes with Cuba's right to trade with other countries around the world. I think that is part of what's happening right now. And I think it's our responsibility to actually counter the narrative and talk about this, to talk about the untalkable, which is the blockade.
Well, let me just ask you this quick follow-up that I think speaks to that. I mean, what do you make of what we saw last Saturday with the demonstrations that came out of people supporting the government? I mean, of course, much derided in the West to the extent it's mentioned.
I mean, we knew what the response would be. It was, of course, it had to be a staged protest. It could never happen in Cuba that people would freely or would politically be interested in participating in a protest in defense of the revolution. And I actually think that people were not actually paying attention to what was being said. I think that President Díaz-canel spoke, I think, very clearly about their own shortcomings, their own contradictions, the fact that the government could do better, has to do better. I think the message of wanting to do more for the Cuban people was absolutely there, but the reality is that nobody in the US media wanted to hear that story. I think the fact that Fox News was even blurring the signs of protesters who can be with the revolution and still criticize the Cuban government for certain things. It's incredible. You know, I think it's sad that the American people, again, because Cuba is not the first example of this, are being completely given a distorted vision of what's happening around the world. They're being given, I would say, a quite manipulated understanding of what's happening only 90 miles away from them.
Well, I think that's actually a critically important point. I'm curious your thoughts about it as well, Reed. It's sort of any expression of discontent in Cuba is like, this is against communism. And certainly the discourse here is, I mean, if someone gets a hangnail in Cuba and they say, oh, everyone hates communism, as if they're, you know, I don't know, people just can't have normal thoughts and conversations, pros, cons, good and bad in the course of their everyday life, but not necessarily be making, you know, a massive geopolitical statement that is lining up with what the U.S. would hope it would.
I mean, certainly,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just thinking about, because I was watching this Fox News thing, and the Maria Elvira Salazar, who was recently elected representative from South Florida, and a Cuban American hardliner, was talking about how this has nothing to do with the economy. It's nothing to do with medicine. This is about the change in government. They want freedom, because that's what they're shouting, and it's true. In those demonstrations, they were shouting libertad, freedom. They were shouting patria y vida, which is a whole nother story we can get into, but it's a song, you know. They were shouting down with communism. That's true. Oh, now where did those come from, right? Mm-hmm. I think it's a good question. But the reality is when you talk to the people, Why are you on the street? They're not talking about those things. They're talking about food and medicine and energy shortages, like probably in that order, or maybe depending on the situation, on their particular situation, maybe it's medicine first. But that is the reason that they took to the streets. It's economic, and why are there shortages of those things? The embargo. So that is 100% the root cause of it. This is not the people are not taking the streets for the freedom. That's not true at all.
When it comes to those slogans that you mentioned, I mean, there also is something that we do need to mention. It's important when we're talking about countries like Cuba, is the U.S. spends a lot of money. I mean, a lot of money, millions of dollars on civil society groups. In the case of Cuba, you can go look at where the USAID money is going, where the National Endowment for Democracy money is going, and it's going to artists to promote freedom and democracy and antagonize, on free market policies and antagonize against communism and socialism. And they really do push it through the arts in Cuba, and they try to do it with musicians as well. I'm curious, is that who is saying those slogans in Cuba? Is it those communities of people? Maybe not communities isn't the right word, but there does appear to be a significant number of artist groups and musician groups that are taking money from USAID and National Endowment for Democracy. And then you have these kinds of slogans.
Yeah, a lot of the money goes to culture and art and artists, and a lot of money goes to media. And what we've seen in Cuba has actually greatly expanded the internet in recent years. It's been, since I started coming to Cuba around 2015, every year it's getting better and better, and there's more and more access. And just a couple of years ago, you could get it on your phone. And that was like a game changer, because before it was you had to go to a Wi-Fi park or hotel, or someone's home, rarely they could have internet. Now anyone has internet on the phone, like most places. And it took them a while to sort of build the infrastructure for that. And as it's been built and growing, more and more people had access to internet. And what happens is that those spaces, and Manola's referenced that, like they are absolutely dominated by like this incredibly powerful media machine, basically out of Miami. And there's $20 million a year. We spend a lot of our time at Belly of the Beast looking into these things. It's not easy, because it's not transparent. I've investigated democracy promotion all around Latin America. And Cuba is the least transparent. It's really hard to figure out where this money is going, because you'll see a grant and it's like $1 million to this organization, and that's all you know. And then you know nothing. There's no other detail about where the money is going. We have been able to learn some things. Like a media organization was created called ADN Cuba. It received $410,000 from USAID in September of 2020. It was created in April of 2020. The money doesn't go to them directly. It goes to another organization called Digital News Association, which is sort of in reverse, essentially same founder of both. No information about where that money is going. We have no idea. We don't know a penny of where that $410,000 is going. What we do know is ADN Cuba basically dedicates itself 100% of the time to being just basically reporting, being a spokesperson for the San Isidro movement of artists, and that has sort of been the poster child of the sort of opposition of Cuba, or sort of the dissidents of Cuba. And San Isidro has been the champion in the U.S. In Cuba, even people who are critical of the Cuban government many people do not really respect San Isidro much, because there's so many of them who have individually have had very close relations with the U.S. government. There are accusations of receiving funding, and some documents that we haven't been able to verify, but indicate that there may be funds being given to them. Several members have come out and openly voiced support for sanctions and for Trump when he was president. There are documented meetings between them and U.S. embassy officials and so on. And so they're not very well respected in Cuba, but in the U.S. they're championed as these heroes. And so you have this media organization that's just pumping out material about San Isidro constantly, funded, or at least indirectly, it seems to be funded by the U.S. government. And they're not the only one. There are others as well. And there's all sorts of money. We don't know where it's going. These programs are essentially covert. A lot of times the recipients of the money don't even know where it's coming from. So you have millions of dollars pouring into this massive media machine that is dominating social media. And you have Cubans who are using social media for the first time and are excited about it, and are on WhatsApp, and they're on Facebook and Instagram and Telegram. And I mean, you talk to any young Cuban, you see what they're consuming, and it's like 99% attacking the government. The government has its own sort of social media efforts, and they're failing miserably. They just can't. They can't counter it. So government they control television, and that's where they get their message out. But that's an older generation. Young people are online, and everything they're getting is attacking the government, and it's absolutely full of fake news. I mean, you can't. In these July 11th protests showed it, because there was so much fake news coming out. Pictures of Alexandria, Egypt after the fall of Mubarak, saying that was the Malecón, and a big protest or a big gathering of soccer fans in Argentina saying that was in Cuba, and a picture of a 13-year-old who was killed or a young kid was killed in Venezuela in blood, and saying that was Cuba, but it actually was Venezuela, saying that the province of Camagüey had been liberated by the protesters, and it turns out it was not true at all. And it's on and on and on. It's just a constant barrage of fake news. And I've seen this has been coming. It's been building and building and building. And I think part of the anger and frustration that's directed at the Cuban government right now, not only by protesters, but in general, a lot of people didn't protest, but blame the Cuban government for the problems. I think it's in large part because of these social media campaigns that have just been building and building for since data became available in Cuba.
Yeah. Well, Manolo, I'm certainly curious on your thoughts on similar issues. I mean, there are all sorts of things that are being picked out and are being looked at. Obviously, one new campaign that's emerged in America in the past week is, I guess, apparently Cuba is the most racist country in the history of all countries in the history of the world. That appears to be what people are saying. And I mean, it's stunning to me on so many levels because, CARICOM, the Caribbean community, those are almost all black countries. Nothing ever coming out about this. The African Union, every African country. I mean, every place that's majority black people in the world has a lot of respect for Cuba. And then yet somehow, anytime there's any issue with Cuba, all these Americans appear, people I've never heard of, all of a sudden, oh, well, this is terrible. It's just a racist country. No one should support them, blah, blah, blah. And that seems like another area where there's just a huge amount of manipulation, whatever you can say. There's a huge amount of manipulation of what's really going on there now, what's happened historically, and especially in the broader regional context of the diaspora, which is, to me, the most relevant part. But anyway, let me not editorialize, but your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's definitely been a lot of manipulation on this. I mean, I think there have been many attempts going back to the early 2000s of wanting to exploit both the sentiments of Afro-Cuban rappers who were critical of the government, raising issues on the different contradictions that still exist within Cuba today. I mean, by no chance is Cuba a perfect society or a society that has somehow eliminated racism. No society has on the planet. But I think Cuba has made great advances in that regard. In most recent years, and right now with these protests taking place in Cuba, virtually, there has been a major focus from some of these media projects funded by the U.S. government to focus on Afro-Cubans as the most exploited group inside Cuba, or the most affected by this blockade that they say doesn't exist, but also by focusing on the idea that Afro-Cubans are the ones leading the protest, or have been the face of these so-called Patria Vida, San Isidro currents that are taking place. I think the reality is much more complex and actually much richer. I think that you actually see that young Afro-Cubans today have not, I wouldn't say, more than anyone else on the planet, but have amazing possibilities to become full human beings, to be treated as full human beings, to access education, to access healthcare, to actually fight back against most of the things that young Afro descendants around the world are denied the right to. I think the fact that Cuba can still stand strong and say that while most countries around the world, including the US, supported apartheid in South Africa, Cuba actually fought effectively against apartheid. That while Mandela was treated as a terrorist by some countries, including the US, Cuba welcomed Mandela and the freedom fighters of the ANC. The fact that Cuba has been a leading voice for reparations in the Caribbean and around the world is a big thing, when this government in the United States has still refused to take that seriously. again, Cuba is not a perfect place. I think Cuba has a lot to grow on when it comes to racial relations, but definitely, there is, like everything else. And I think you can add to that LGBT issues, you can add to that women's issues, you can add to that a series of other issues that these media laboratories of the extreme right in Miami are using to create a level of unrest, of civil unrest and social unrest that don't necessarily exist on the ground.
Well, I mean, to follow up, because not that I disagree with anything you're saying, and maybe I'm agreeing with you 100%, but it just feels like the metrics are absurd. I mean, this is a hemisphere that was plunged into 500 years of slavery. You know what I mean? This is the most intense racism created by these European countries and the settler colonial countries that existed, for hundreds of years, pushed a Jim Crow system. Jim Crow, of course, in Cuba, until the revolution. I'm always reminded of Victor Drake, his memoir, where he talks about the importance to him and other Black students of the ability to, because of the revolution, finally start to remove these marks of segregation, like the rope between Blacks and whites at dances, which anyone who has a grandparent from the U.S. South knows that was also a feature of that as well. And I am going to editorialize here. Go look at the photo of Fidel coming out of prison in the Moncada and see what race some of those people were, and then talk to me. But to get back to my point, Manolo, it just seems like if you're going to measure a country by anything, when we measure countries by life expectancy, by literacy, all these different things, you say, well, we compare those countries to the countries in their region, countries of similar size, countries of similar resources. But with Cuba, it just seems like we just create this arbitrary standard. Well, they don't have 100% of everything we would want, so communism has failed. Rather than, I mean, there's a reason why all the developing countries in Africa just about have Cubans working there in the critical parts of the economy. I don't know, I'm saying too much. Manolo, stop me before.
I mean, I just always go to where the practice is. I mean, what has been Cuba's practice? I mean, the US has still failed to show the world that capitalism is successful. I'm sorry. Show me Haiti, show me Colombia, show me the rest of the world where capitalism is successful. But I think ultimately Cuba's practice is coherently anti-racist. I think that's the most important thing to point out. How it actually develops, it doesn't develop affirmative action because the whole economy, the whole society is geared towards including Black people and Afro-descendants. Again, not that there isn't racism. Racism is a structural problem that has to be confronted. And I think the Cubans are struggling with it, but finding ways to attack it, which is more than I could say for the U.S. society, which is still drowning its own young Black people in blood every day.
Yeah. Such a crucial point. Trinidad has like a advisory they used to a couple years ago about be worried if you come to the United States, you might get killed by the cops. Sorry, Rania, I cut you off.
No. I think that's all a very important conversation, given some of the insane statements we heard made by awful liberals over the last week, especially people appearing in mainstream media trying to project American racism and race relations onto Cuba in such an absurd way. I think somebody, I can't remember who it was, but was saying in Cuba, they won't teach critical race theory. And I was like, what is this conversation?
Critical race theory, which is about the
absurd.
United States. Like, it's not about the world, it's about
Cuba,
the U.S. legal code.
Why would Cuba teach
But I always ask
critical
the
race
question,
theory?
Rania. What would happen to Black people in Cuba if the U.S. were to intervene tomorrow? What would be their
it
fate?
wouldn't be good. Yes.
Can we assure them that
good.
somehow U.S. intervention brings, the end to racism, somehow brings absolute racial equality?
Yeah.
Where has that worked?
Well, if we look at a place like Libya and see what intervention brought, it brought back slave markets. So I don't think U.S. intervention has a good record anywhere at all. Like, tell me one place where U.S. intervention did better for people, let alone for the most marginalized people in society. That said, I was really disturbed by something Reed was saying, which you were talking about the sort of like dominance of right-wing media online, whether it's U.S. funded or coming out of Miami or whatever. Now that Cubans have more access to the internet with the infrastructure being built. I'm curious, and Manolo, this goes to you too as well. Like, that disturbs me because that to me says that we're in a new era where what's online really does matter. And if the government can't compete with that, then what is the government doing to try to push back against that, because that can destroy a country. I've seen it happen in other places. I mean, I would hope that in Cuba, because it has a socialist ideology and it's a leftist country, maybe unlike some other places where this kind of stuff has worked to cause collapse, maybe that's strong enough. But is there an ongoing effort that's successful to continue to help younger generations understand what's at stake, right? Because it's easy. I mean, and I think Cuba's gone through this over the decades, because the first generation that does a revolution, they know what they won and they know what it was like before. But once you get to the next generation and the generation after that, it gets more difficult for people to really understand what what people didn't have before that they have now, and why it's so important to maintain these things. So how is the government, or people who want to keep what they've won, how are they pushing back against that sort of information warfare?
Well, the first thing I would ever point out is that look at Biden's National Security Agency's strategic guidance that came out in March. It's a short document, 20 pages. Many people didn't read it or didn't look at it, but it constantly refers to this need to wage unconventional warfare and to have a complete domination of cyberspace, of cyber warfare against other countries. And I think sort of many of the steps of what we're seeing in Cuba, and this sort of full spectrum domination of the media by the right, it was actually being described by Biden's guidance to the NSA. I think we should pay attention to the fact that these are not coincidentals, these are not random acts of aggression by the United States, but it's part of a full strategy developed by the US government over many years to overthrow the Cuban Revolution. And secondly, I think that the Cuban government has many challenges to face in the coming years, both economic, social, cultural, political, but ultimately it's their challenges to figure out. I think it's unfair for people in the US to sit down and create panels to discuss and decide for the Cuban people how they develop out their future. I think if our responsibility ultimately is, if we were to actually get that knee off the neck of the Cuban people, they would have so much more breathing space to actually engage in more dialogue, to engage in dealing with these internal contradictions, if there wasn't that much level of US intervention and pressure.
Reed, go ahead.
No, I just going off what Manolo just said. There was a great piece I read recently where it basically tracked, how acts of repression by the Cuban government or crackdowns on dissidents, and it basically coincides. The more repressive the U.S. is towards Cuba, the tougher sanctions are, the more the U.S.'s war against Cuba is waged. Then the more sort of the Cuban government then it gets into the state of siege mentality, and the more the U.S. leaves Cuba alone, the more Cuba opens up, and the more space there is for that. Not only does the economy have a chance to improve, but there's more space for dialogue and for Cubans to figure out their own problems. The series we did, The War on Cuba, Liz ends the series. Liz, the presenter, is Cuban, and says, "Listen, you say that socialism doesn't work and communism doesn't work. Well, okay, lift the embargo, and then we'll find out if it works or not. Because as long as the embargo's there, we're not going to know." And I think that's absolutely right. Like their hands are so tied in so many ways. So we'll see. I'd be fascinated, for one, if the U.S. stopped waging a war, and it should be called that as well, because there's a lot of ways to call it: embargo, sanctions, the blockade. It is war. The U.S. is waging war. The President Diaz-canel said recently, "We're in a wartime economy." That's not an exaggeration. They are in a wartime economy, and the U.S. is waging a war against Cuba. You can imagine what it would be like in the United States if a country 1,000 times more powerful was waging an economic war against a country, funding groups to try to overthrow the government, and essentially like hell-bent on destroying the country and overthrowing government and taking over. You can sort of imagine what the environment might be in the U.S. in terms of civil liberties and the space for dialogue. I think that it's just impossible to judge Cuba as long as the U.S. is waging this war.
Well,
I mean, just to your point, real quick, I would like to point out you're asking what the U.S. would do. I mean, just look at how the U.S. reacted on January 6th when some people tried to storm the Capitol. They're still like in a, having a psychological episode collectively as a country over that. So, I mean, and that's like a blip compared to what the U.S. is doing to Cuba, a tiny little blip. So yeah, that's a very, very well said point. Sorry, go ahead, Eugene.
No. I think that's all good points, all very well taken. We could be here all day talking about this. I mean, there's a lot to it, and we'll have to continue to cover it and continue to look at it. Reed Lindsay, Manolo De Los Santos, really appreciate you. Everyone out there watching, definitely check out Belly of the Beast. I also will say check out 1804 Books at the People's Forum. That has a lot of great selections about Cuba on pretty much all the topics we've already listed here. But thank you both so much for giving us your time.